for scintillating entertainment.
Always, right? Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon. I will now call the meeting to order. I am Robert Mujica, the State Budget Director, and the Governor has designated me to chair this meeting. I'd like to note that today we have the following designated observers here today. We have Doreen Insera from the Office of the Senate Majority Leader. We have Mark Wurzel from the observer from the City Council's Minority Leader, and we have Matthew Harnish, observer from the Speaker of the Assembly, are all here today with us, so we welcome them. I will now entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the last meeting. The meeting was held on July 25th of 2018. These minutes have been distributed to the members for comment. Do I have any comments? Do we have a motion? Motion to approve the minutes. Second motion. The minutes. All in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
The minutes are approved. The next item on the agenda will be the presentation of the financial plan for fiscal years 2020 through 2023. And Mr. Mayor, I understand that you will present the city's four-year financial plan.
Thank you very much. I want to thank our acting chair and state budget director, Robert Mujica, for the introduction. And for the sixth year in a row, I want to thank the members of this board for the work you do on behalf of our city and our state. I want to acknowledge two partners whose work is indispensable in everything we do. Comptroller of the state, Tom DiNapoli, Comptroller of the city, Scott Stringer. I want to thank them and their staffs as well. Of course, thanks to the private members. It's been an honor working with you, John Levin and Lawrence Gullub. Thank you so much. And the FCB's acting executive director, Jeff Summer. Thank you for all you've done for many years for all of us. We worked closely with the City Council and thank them for their partnership in reaching our budget agreement in June. And I want to thank the members of my team who are here for the work they did in the budget process and do every day. First Deputy Mayor Dean Foulihan, Budget Director Melanie Hartzog, and their staffs as well. So here's the overview. The fiscal year 2020 adopted budget is $92.77 billion. It is balanced with record levels of reserves and manageable out-year gaps. And before I go into detail on the adopted budget, I want to talk to you about why we have put it together the way we have. I want to take us back to the beginning of this year when there was some good news, job growth was strong, and the city's unemployment rate was low, but we also saw a bigger picture and some real challenges. At that point, we're in the 116th month of the longest recovery since World War II. Which is something to celebrate, but also a reason to be hesitant about what would come next. Markets had just posted steep losses in December. The housing sector had become weaker, and we faced threats related to foreign trade conflicts. Obviously, those threats have only intensified since. Many leading economists at that time forecast that the national economy would slow. At the same time, we saw tax revenue slowing in comparison to the preceding year, and we faced budget hits and risks both from Albany and Washington. We responded by deepening our commitment to fiscal prudence. I set a mandatory savings goal of $750 million for the executive budget, which included an expansion of the partial hiring freeze and this administration's first program to eliminate the gap. We maintain that commitment over the next months as we move closer to adoption, even as financial markets recovered. We focused on two areas: growing our savings and increasing our already significant reserves. First, our focus on savings. We have maintained aggressive savings plans during strong revenue periods and as growth has slowed. The wisdom of this approach is clear, as these savings plans have allowed us to balance the budget and finance necessary initiatives. Every year, OMB and city agencies work together to examine internal processes and use existing resources more efficiently, including an evaluation of personnel needs. OMB also develops initiatives to make use of shared resources and economies of scale across all of our city agencies. Now, because of these efforts, we achieved almost $2.9 billion in savings over fiscal years 19 and 20 since the last adoption. These savings were attained in part through the PEG and a permanent reduction of nearly 3,000 city-funded personnel positions in this fiscal year. But we certainly aren't done. Over the course of the year, we will continue to find ways to save taxpayer dollars, while maintaining the critical services that New Yorkers need and expect. Second, we've increased the level of budget reserves every single year of this administration so that we're ready in the event of a downturn. We have a buffer from the unexpected. This year is no exception. We increased reserves to nearly $6 billion, and that is a record level for the City of New York. This includes $1.15 billion in the General Reserve, $4.57 billion in the Retiree Health Benefits Trust Fund, and $250 million in the Capital Stabilization Reserve. Because of our year-long savings efforts and cautious planning at the end of fiscal year 19, we were able to make a $4.22 billion prepayment on fiscal year 2020 expenses, leaving fiscal years 2019 and 2020 balanced. I'm proud to say these efforts haven't gone unnoticed. Our consistent focus on savings and reserves has been routinely praised by fiscal monitors and rating agencies. In March, Moody's Investor Services upgraded the city's GO bond rating to AA1, the highest level ever achieved by the city, and our first ratings increase in nearly a decade. In making the upgrade, Moody's cited our strong financial management and improvements in our financial position that reflect a greater capacity to withstand an economic downturn. So that's the level of prudent fiscal management we've always believed was the foundation to a progressive government. That's what allows us to invest in the city in the responsible way we have. And before I conclude, I just want to highlight some of these investments. Much of the new agency spending in fiscal year 2020 went towards supporting basic city operations and mandates. This included funding upcoming elections, maintaining water and sewer services, and addressing NYPD's critical IT infrastructure needs. Our investments are guided by a simple question I spoke about at this meeting last year. How does this help us keep building the fairest big city in America? You'll find that this year's plan goes a long way to further that mission. We're investing in health care, as too many New Yorkers lack access to affordable quality coverage. At the State of the City, we announced NYC Care, part of our plan to guarantee health care access for 600,000 uninsured New Yorkers. We enhanced efforts to boost Metro Plus, New York City's public option. At full ramp-up, this investment will total $100 million per year. We're investing in mental health care as well, especially for younger New Yorkers. This year, we will place 200 additional social workers in our public schools, including mental health specialists working within the Thrive initiative. We'll continue to invest in affordable housing, which is so critical for vulnerable New Yorkers, and we're protecting this city and all New Yorkers from the impact of climate change. As part of NYC's Green New Deal, we invested $60 million to retrofit city buildings with green technology, reflecting our ongoing focus on energy efficiency. We're making sure as well that every New Yorker is counted in the 2020 census. In partnership with the City Council, we invested $40 million to fund outreach staff and a public awareness campaign to make sure that New York is counted and we get our fair share in federal funding and federal representation. And of course, nothing is more central to a fair New York City than bringing equity to our schools. That's why we're continuing to invest in education, which my administration has been focused on since day one. This year, we expanded 3K for All by funding 1,900 new seats in the Bronx and Brooklyn. This investment brings 3K to 12 districts and 20,000 children this September. The quality of our pre-K and 3K initiatives depends on recruiting and retaining quality early childhood educators. And last week, I'm proud to say, DC 1707 and the Daycare Council of New York City ratified an agreement that honors the commitment we made at adoption to develop a pathway to pay parity for our early childhood educators. We will add related funding in the fall, and this agreement will serve as a model for the remaining certified providers going forward. Similarly, in recognition of the critical role legal defense attorneys play in the justice system, the city will continue conversations with providers to effectively address recruitment and retention issues in that sector as well. Finally, I'll note that in April we released the $116.9 billion 10-year capital strategy that details the city's infrastructure plan. Our investments support expanding and enhancing school facilities, making repairs and safety improvements to roads and bridges, and building and preserving record levels of affordable housing. 75% of all capital funds are invested in maintaining or improving the city's capital asset base, reflecting a continued focus on state of good repair. And as we have in the past, we have debt service payments below 15% of our city tax revenue, the benchmark for responsible capital financing. To conclude, as always, I want to thank the Financial Control Board for your work. This partnership makes New York City stronger, and this year's budget continues to make the case that our administration has made for years now, that prudent financial management and big progressive change are not mutually exclusive, that we can be guided by fiscal responsibility and make the investments we need to build a growing, thriving city in every single borough. We have more work to do, but these investments in our people in our city will continue to push us towards a future where fairness is a defining part of life in New York City. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. State Comptroller DiNapoli, do you have any comments on the city's financial plan?
Thank you, Rob. I do have a few. And thank you, Mayor de Blasio, for your report and all of your efforts. I'd like to offer some brief observations on behalf of the Office of State Comptroller. Members of the board have a copy of our review of the financial plan of the City of New York, which provides the detail prepared by our Office for New York City, headed by Ken Blyweiss, our Deputy Controller, who joins me here today. New York City, as the mayor pointed out, is currently experiencing the largest and longest job expansion in the post-World War II period. Since 2009, the city has added 824,000 jobs, bringing employment to a record level of more than 4.5 million in 2018, and reducing the annual unemployment rate to 4.1%, the lowest on record. Strong job growth has continued in 2019, and the unemployment rate remains near its record low. The city is on track to add 94,400 jobs in 2019, a faster pace than last year. The strength of the local economy has made balancing the budget easier in recent years. Fiscal year 2019 ended with a surplus of $4.2 billion, which was used to help balance the 2020 budget. The surplus resulted mostly from the citywide savings program, unneeded reserves, and higher than expected revenues. Unanticipated revenues accounted for almost half of the surplus. The citywide savings program generated nearly $1.8 billion in 2019 and is expected to produce about $1 billion in each subsequent fiscal year. Despite the savings program, staffing levels continue to grow. The 2020 budget totals $92.8 billion, including $68.5 billion funded with locally generated revenues. Spending has grown relatively rapidly in recent years, and although it is currently affordable, it may not be sustainable during a prolonged economic downturn. Spending is driven by projected increases in health insurance costs and debt service, the impact of the state budget, and higher agency spending. Unplanned agency spending and new initiatives increased costs by $2.9 billion during fiscal years 2019 and 2020, more than offsetting the benefit of the agency savings program in those years. Despite record employment and a balanced budget in 2020, the city projects budget gaps of $3.5 billion in 2021, $2.9 billion in 2022, and $3.1 billion in 2023. The budgets for these years include reserves of $1.25 billion that, if unneeded, could be used to narrow those gaps. Although the gaps are manageable under existing conditions, the current job expansion is in its 10th year and changes in the business cycle are inevitable. Most economists believe the risk of a national recession has grown as a result of increased trade tensions and slower global economic growth. While the June plan assumes that the city's economy will slow during the financial plan period, it does not anticipate a recession. In the absence of an economic setback, tax collections are likely to exceed the city's forecasts. If unplanned spending is held in check, these unplanned revenues could be available to help narrow the out-year budget gaps. Although the immediate risk of federal budget cuts has been reduced by the recent two-year budget agreement, there remains the potential for cuts during the latter part of the financial plan period, given the large and growing federal budget deficit. Another concern is the growing size of the city's unfunded OPEB liability, which exceeded $98 billion at the end of fiscal year 2018, $10 billion more than the year before. In addition, the city's current 10-year capital strategy, the largest on record, is expected to increase city-funded debt service by 49% between fiscal years 2018 and 2023. Although the debt burden would rise to 12.9% of tax revenues, it would remain below the city's target or benchmark of 15%. The Health and Hospitals Corporation, the New York City Housing Authority, and the Metropolitan Transportation Authority also face significant operational and financial challenges, which could require additional support from the city. Given these risks, the city increased the general reserve for fiscal year 2020 to $1.15 billion, while maintaining the stabilization reserve at $250 million. If unneeded, these resources could contribute to a year-end surplus that could be used to help balance the 2021 budget. The city also deposited an additional $100 million into the Retiree Health Benefits Trust, which now has a record balance of nearly $4.6 billion. Although intended to fund post-retirement benefits other than pensions, it should be remembered that the city drew on the trust during the Great Recession to help balance the city's budget. In closing, the city's economy is strong, but the risk of an economic setback during the financial plan period has grown. To its credit, the city continues to increase its reserves, a practice that it should continue given the risks on the horizon. The city should also step up its efforts to identify opportunities to reduce costs in order to help close the projected budget gaps. So to wrap up, I'd like to commend Mayor de Blasio and his team, City Controller Stringer, the City Council, and their respective staffs for all of their efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Controller DiNapoli. Controller Stringer, do you have any comments on the city's financial plan?
Yes, and I want to start out by first acknowledging our first Deputy Controller, Elena Gilligo, our Deputy Controller for Budget, Preston Niblak, as well as our partners, Mayor de Blasio, Controller DiNapoli, Budget Director Mojica, and the members of the Financial Control Board. It's great to be back with you again. I'm pleased to report today that our city's economy and fiscal condition continued strong in fiscal year 2019. New York City has added over 900,000 jobs since the end of the Great Recession. Average wages are rising, up 4.4% in the last quarter, and we've now entered the longest sustained period of economic growth in modern history. This is an extraordinary accomplishment. Among other things, the economy's strength has allowed our city to enjoy low borrowing costs. In collaboration with the Mayor's Office of Management and Budget, my office has achieved nearly $4.5 billion in savings from bond refinancing since 2014, building up crucial resources at a time when every penny counts. I'm also happy to report today that despite a year in which the markets were characterized by volatility, trade conflicts, and instability in the technological sector, our pension funds finished the year up 7.24%, above our actuarial target of 7.0%. 10 years after the rock bottom of the financial crisis, our funds are stronger than ever. And that's due to the strong partnership we have between the trustees, the Mayor's Office, and our own Bureau of Asset Management. It's actually our most important job. So looking at these facts, it's clear that by the numbers, we have benefited from a solid economy. We ended fiscal year 2019 with a balanced budget of $93.4 billion, an increase of $4.3 billion when the budget was adopted. And almost all of that increase was a surplus that we used to help balance the fiscal year 2020 budget as well. The FY 2020 budget is also balanced at $92.8 billion, thanks to the FY 2019 surplus. Adjusted for prepayments, the budget is $95.6 billion, up a modest 1.6% from FY 2019. The 2020 budget also took forward-looking steps on several important priorities that I've long advocated for: providing parity for certified contract child care workers, their attorneys with their city counterparts will bring more fairness to our economy and pay off in the long run for our children. In addition, the administration and the council agreed to reimburse human services contractors for their true indirect costs. This is a reform we've long called for that delivers an overdue investment in the long-run viability of our critical human service providers. We applaud these investments in a more equitable New York. But as we all know, we do not have unlimited resources. We must manage our budget with care today for the long-run benefit of our city. Spending in the FY20 budget increased by just over $1 billion between the executive proposal and the adopted plan, including $454 million in City Council initiatives, a rise of over 17% from last year. It also includes $258 million in spending by the administration on other priorities identified by the Council. Plus, when you add in new spending needs that total $228 million in FY 2020 and roughly $160 million annually in the out years, this becomes close to quarter of a billion dollars. So for the first time since 2014, the FY 2019 surplus roll declined compared to the FY 2018 surplus by $355 million. Went from $4.58 billion to just $4.22 billion. In other words, despite the $150 million added to the FY 2020 General Reserve and the $100 million deposit to the Retiree Health Trust, we not only didn't add to our budget cushion, we actually reduced it. That's the first time this has happened since 2014. The budget cushion fell from 11.3% of budgeted spending at the beginning of FY 2019 to 10.7% at the beginning of FY 2020. That's $1.2 billion short of the minimum level of 12% that we should be working towards. If we're going to build the savings we need to safeguard our fiscal condition, we have to acknowledge that our resources are not endless. We have to take the long view for our city's long-term fiscal health. So while our fiscal position remains strong today, and it does, finding the necessary savings to ensure the sustainability of these initiatives in the future is imperative. A greater share of those savings should come from city agencies. From the total of nearly $6 billion in the citywide savings plan for fiscal years 2019 through 2023, only $840 million, or 14%, can genuinely be attributed to agency savings. We must continue to work together to ensure the citywide savings plan relies less on refinances, reestimates of spending, and funding swaps between state and federal funds, while asking more from our agencies. Today, our city budget is balanced. Our credit rating is strong, and we've built a strong foundation for future generations of New Yorkers. Taking these additional steps is central to our ability to ensure that today's investments in the future are sustainable, whether we face a recession or some unforeseen future event. I look forward to continuing to work with the mayor and our partners here today to build on a foundation we've laid and continue to move our city forward for generations to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comptroller Stringer. We'll now turn to Jeff Summer, the Acting Executive Director, to present the staff comments to the Financial Control Board.
Thank you. Over the course of fiscal 2019, the operating budget increased by $4.3 billion to $93.4 billion. Despite the federal government shutdown, uncertainty over the direction of interest rates, and trade frictions, consumers remain confident. City fund revenue rose by almost $2.5 billion, mostly from increased non-property taxes and largely one-time miscellaneous revenues. The city was able to use the higher revenues together with agency and debt service savings and the drawdown of reserves to build a surplus of a little over $4.2 billion and add $100 million to the Retiree Health Benefits Trust. The entire surplus was used to prepay fiscal 2020 expenses and help balance that year's budget. Compared to the executive budget, the fiscal 2020 adopted budget added almost $1 billion in spending, including one-time city council initiatives and new agency needs, as well as adding $150 million to the general reserve. The new spending was offset by increasing the city's tax revenue forecast by $296 million and using the fiscal 2019 surplus roll. The fiscal year 2020 to 23 financial plan makes only minor changes to the out years. While the fiscal 2020 budget is balanced, the out-year gaps are relatively unchanged at $3.5 billion in fiscal 2021, $2.9 billion in 22, and $3.1 billion in 23. Fiscal 2020 has a general reserve of $1.15 billion and a capital stabilization reserve of $250 million. Each out year of the plan has a combined $1.25 billion from those reserves. The out-year gaps exist because recurring expenditures continue to outpace recurring revenues. Over the plan, expenditure growth is attributed to higher costs for wages and fringe benefits. The wage increases reflect the recent collective bargaining agreements reached with several major unions in the financial plan, assuming the remaining unions will agree to the pattern set by those contracts. Fringe benefits grow largely due to rising health benefit costs for current and retired employees, even though the city has reached agreements with the Municipal Labor Committee for recurring health care savings. In addition, debt service costs continue to be a main driver of expenditure growth. The city's recently announced 10-year capital strategy is a record $116.9 billion, with 78% funded from city tax revenues. While the large capital plan will increase city debt service at an average annual rate of 7.8% over the financial plan, it appears to be affordable under current economic conditions, as debt service as a percent of tax revenues remains well under the 15% established threshold. I would also like to commend the mayor and the city controller for recently releasing a written city debt policy for the first time. This increased spending is affordable in the short term, but may not be sustainable in the long term. The city continues to maintain a conservative revenue forecast given current economic conditions. Currently, tax and miscellaneous revenues are supported by sustained growth in jobs, income, and consumer spending despite abrupt changes in interest rate policy and trade tensions. Over the long term, however, the city could be faced with an economic downturn. It is uncertain how long the slowdown in global growth will persist, if consumer spending will weaken, when, as the last few days have warned, the effect of tariffs becomes more pronounced, where interest rates are headed, and if federal budget cuts will occur. Federal actions could have a direct impact on the New York City Housing Authority and Health Plus hospitals, and the city will see if their subsidies will have to be increased. Given these unknowns, the city should continue to have high levels of reserves, maintain conservative revenue projections, control the increase in agency spending, and develop and implement agency savings programs throughout the financial plan period. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Do any of the private members have any comments? Mr. Golub?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Comptrollers. On behalf of John Levin and I, the two private members, I'd like to comment on the city's fiscal condition. Mr. Mayor, as you pointed out, the city was once again able to manage the fiscal year 2019 budget to generate a large surplus of $4.2 billion, which is being used to balance the fiscal 2020 budget. The surplus was created by higher than expected tax revenues, unneeded reserves, and agency savings programs. As Comptroller as Comptroller Stringer has pointed out, this amount is about $355 million lower than the prepayments from the fiscal year 2018 surplus. This decline reflects that expenses grew faster than revenues during fiscal year 2019. Looking at the four-year financial plan, as Director Sommer pointed out, it is clear that expected growth in expenditures is going to outpace the projected growth in revenues, creating out-year budget gaps. The city has added almost $1 billion in new city-funded expenditures in fiscal year 2020, and with that said, the plan contains a general reserve and capital stabilization reserve totaling $1.4 billion in fiscal year 2020 and $1.25 billion in each of the out years. We expect the city to continue to develop and implement agency savings programs. The city should therefore be able to build up a surplus in fiscal year 2020, and the out-year gap should be manageable. We want to recognize and applaud that the city has added an additional $100 million to the Retiree Health Benefits Trust, which now totals almost $4.6 billion. As Comptroller DiNapoli pointed out, though, the unfunded retiree health benefits liability grew by about $10 billion from fiscal year 2017 to fiscal year 2018 to a total of over $98 billion. And as we, the private members, have said for many years, while we welcome new contributions, the level of contributions are not sufficient to deal with the long-term risk that the unfunded $98 billion liability creates. We'd also like to express our opinion that the amount of reserves in the healthcare retiree benefit trust should not be considered a reserve that can be used in an economic downturn. To draw down these funds, as opposed to taking other actions, would continue to push off dealing with a long-term fiscal problem. The trust should be increased, not reduced. We believe that while the city's investment in its priorities are affordable now, they may not be sustainable in the long term. The plan is based on revenue estimates assuming a continuation of existing favorable economic trends, which might not be sustained. We agree with the other members of the board that the greatest risk to the city's finances is a potential major downturn in the national or local economy. An eventual downturn is inevitable. In that regard, we recommend that the city start a contingency planning process to identify its priorities and how they would be sustained if there were a revenue downturn. It should develop proposals that could be promptly implemented when necessary to avoid having to take unplanned action. Thank you for letting us comment.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mayor, do you have any comments on the comments of the speakers?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it. I want to thank the controllers and the executive director and the private members for all of their analysis and comments, which I appreciate very much. Just want to say a few things and then just quickly turn to the first deputy mayor to add as well. Answering some of these crucial points, I want everyone to understand that the governing philosophy was to maintain the strength of the city economically as well as in terms of the quality of life of our people. The investments that we've made, for example, 2,000 more police officers on patrol, or the investments in improving education, directly connect to our strength and stability as a city, and certainly to an economic environment that encourages investment, encourages job growth. So I think that all of the concerns raised are important, and we're listening to them carefully, but I want to recognize that what we're doing is not just about day-to-day quality of life in the city. We certainly value that intensely, but it is also about creating the most propitious environment for continued economic growth, which obviously has ramifications in terms of revenue and the ability to have a diversified, strong economy that can weather the storms ahead, which we all agree are inevitable. We just don't, we never get a memo telling us when they're going to happen, but we know they're inevitable. I have heard from many people in the business community, and particularly in one of our strongest growing sectors, which is technology, how important the investments in education are, for example, and areas like job training, in terms of their focus and willingness to keep investing in New York City. This is, I think there's a direct cause and effect there. So I wanted to make that point in terms of some of the underlying strategic assumptions behind the spending. Just to answer a few other crucial points, on the surplus that rolled from this fiscal year forward versus last year we experienced some truly aberrant dynamics related to the specific reality of the new federal tax law in particular that create a surge in short-term revenue. It's not surprising that once that passed, we would, if you will, come back down to earth and have a more consistent situation this year. So I wanted to make that point. I do understand the interpretation of reserves on a percentage basis. I still come back to it's unprecedented to have 6 years in a row where the city's absolute reserves keep growing, and obviously to a very high level at $6 billion. Want to note also to the points that were raised about ongoing savings, absolutely. We have created a tradition of savings in two areas. One, agencies are consistently being asked to find savings, and they have, and they will going forward. So that's an area we're devoted to. A second, the healthcare savings. A very cooperative, productive environment between municipal labor and management has allowed us now for 6 years to continue to move forward on healthcare savings, more to come. Continued structure in place to develop even further healthcare savings. But everything that we've locked in healthcare savings is ongoing, which is something that did not exist in the past. Finally, two other points, and then quickly to the first deputy mayor on the Health and Hospitals Corporation was noted. I want everyone to recognize there's been extraordinary changes in the last few years at Health and Hospitals. They're on a much sounder footing than I think they've been in a long, long time. I think it's right for the concern to be raised about potential federal actions that might negatively impact Health and Hospitals. I will say, although I am never what's the word I'm looking for? I will never sugarcoat the vagaries of Washington, D.C. At this moment, I do believe on the healthcare front, particularly in terms of the DISH payments, we've seen consistent support for keeping continuity in Washington. I am hopeful, although there'll be definitely a debate that has to be had, I am hopeful about a positive outcome there. Short of some unusual negative federal action, I'm very confident that Health and Hospitals is continuing to become more efficient, and you'll see strong fiscal management. Also on infrastructure and capital spending, Want to remind everyone, we are the poster child city for aging infrastructure. Thank God we have such a strong economy, but there has not been a federal infrastructure plan to the scale we need for many, many years. We are having to, as a city, make infrastructure investments that I think for a lot of people here who have been involved in public life for a long time would have been unimaginable in the past. But there has not been any prospect of a serious new federal infrastructure plan for years. So we go ahead and do that to keep roads and bridges and so many other things in a state of good repair, our water system most notably. We don't have a choice but to increase capital spending to keep, again, quality of life high and economic strength high. I look forward to the day, and I believe that day could come, when there is a coherent and large federal infrastructure program, and that's one of the ways I think we could get some relief. But in the meantime, we're going to keep making aggressive investments, but always staying under that 15% debt service level. And just quickly, I know First Deputy Mayor wanted to add.
Just to amplify 2 points on the mayor and on the health, retiree health benefits. Not only for the first time have we reached the highest level that the trust fund has ever had, and every single year of the administration we made investments in it. It is worth remembering that this is the first administration with the cooperation of the Municipal Labor Committee and the entire part of our union partners, that we will, by the end of this contract period, have savings on an annual basis of $1.9 billion. So that significantly goes also to address that issue. On the pension side, which is a constitutional obligation where we do have flexibility on the health side, on the pension side, more than half of our over $9 billion is actually to make sure that we get to 100% financing, and we will be achieving that by 2037. So that is paying that off, and it's more than half of the contribution we right now make to the pension system. I just wanted to make those 2 points in response to your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First Deputy Mayor. I'll now call on Jeff Summer for the staff's findings regarding fiscal year 2019, as well as the recommendation regarding the resolution before us.
The Financial Emergency Act contains 5 conditions that we review to determine whether or not the city is experiencing fiscal stress, and I'd like to run through them now for the board. The city shall have incurred a deficit in excess of $100 million in the results of operations. The city has ended fiscal 2019 subject to the final audit with a surplus of just over $4.2 billion and has prepaid fiscal 2020 expenses. Number 2 is the city shall have failed to pay principal or interest on any of its notes or bonds when due and payable. 3, the city shall have issued notes in violation of restrictions on short-term borrowing set forth in Section 9B of the Act. And 4, the controllers shall have jointly certified that they could not, on the basis of the facts existing at the time of such certification, make the joint certification required to terminate a control period. In short, they certified that there's sufficient market access for the city to meet its needs. The city has paid all principal and interest on its notes and bonds and has not violated any of the short-term borrowing provisions of the FEA. I have also received letters from the state and city controllers informing me that they do not see any likelihood that they would have reason to issue a joint certification relating to market access. And the last condition is the city shall have violated any provisions of the Act, and such violation substantially impairs the ability of the city to pay principal or interest on its bonds or notes when due and payable, or the city's ability to adopt or adhere to a balanced operating budget. The city has not violated any provisions of the Act. The staff therefore recommends that the board approve a resolution determining that as of August 7, 2019, none of the events which would have required the imposition of a control period has occurred, nor is there a substantial likelihood and imminence of such occurrence, and that the city is not experiencing fiscal stress that would jeopardize the orderly functioning of the city's fiscal affairs.
Thank you. Do we have any comments on the staff's recommendation from the board members? Hearing none, I'd like to entertain a motion to approve the determination.
So moved.
Is there a second? Seconded. Hearing all in favor of the motion? The motion is passed. Now I'd like to entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
So moved.
Do we have seconded? All in favor? Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Most efficient meeting chair in America.
Thank you.